What's up, everybody? Just doing a quick video. Been brainstorming some ways to try and accurately map the plane without necessarily using all the assumptions historically used to construct all of the maps leading up to this point. It's common knowledge that the accepted conventional maps are not an accurate depiction of the ground or the face of the Earth. The reason for this is supposedly owing to the world being a globe. If you never attended a single day of geography, then I'll go ahead and tell you that most modern maps are based on crude interpretations which basically assume the Earth to be a sphere, which makes it rather difficult to illustrate how this would appear on a two-dimensional map, understandably. Allegedly, the Mercator projection, which was created in the 1500s, is such a map. However, I'm not so sure whether Mercator was a flat earther or a globehead. In fact, Spanish explorers were kicking off a 150-year span of mapping and exploring California, right around the time when Mercator was polishing off his projection of the map, which included the New World, only discovered in the late 1400s by Columbus, the murdering lunatic. I find it fascinating that the Mercator projection was created without any detailed knowledge of the actual landscape of the Americas, but he somehow managed to do it. Of course, there are major problems with the Mercator projection in terms of being an accurate depiction of the face of the Earth, of course. The reason I believe the Mercator projection is not an accurate depiction of the face of the world is because it's a cylindrical conformal map. That is the definition of the Mercator projection, so if you look up those terms involved with cartography, they essentially mean that the map is closest to correct directly across the equator line. However, the further north or south you travel from the equator, the less and less correct it gets, or in other words, the more and more skewed the relative sizes of and distances between continents and landmasses become. Up to the point at the poles, of course, are the 90 degrees north and south latitudes, where the polar latitudes, which are supposedly a single point, but each of those points, each of those polar points is stretched or supposedly stretched out to infinity on the Mercator projection, or on any cylindrical conformal map. What this means is the maps that you've always looked at are not an accurate representation of what the landmasses actually look like, nor the relative distances between the continents correct. These errors in depiction become worse and worse as distance is gained from the equator using the Mercator projection. That's just the way the map was designed. Now, the reason the Mercator projection has remained a viable navigational tool, especially for mariners since the 1500s, is due to the fact that the map was designed to aid them in their reckoning, which has historically been done using the celestial calculations, using a sextant, a compass, the sun by day and the stars by night, and of course a map and the manual tools that go along with that. Using the sun and stars is an ingenious method of navigation, I must say, and the fact that a person as ancient as Mercator, yes, the 1500s is ancient in my opinion, but he was able to create such an accurate depiction of lands that spanned the entire world, not to mention most of the American continent, which was barely being discovered, especially in the case in what is modern-day California. There's another angle on this which isn't often discussed, but I think it ought to be. I have a suspicion that Mercator was actually a flat earther. Let's face it, people have been navigating the seas quite accurately under the assumption that the Earth is a plane for the majority of history. Not to mention, the Mercator projection itself is set up so that you can only circumnavigate the world going east to west and certainly not north to south. Now, when Columbus sailed to America in the late 1400s, Newton's famous Principia wouldn't even be written for another 100 years, and then some. And the idea that the Earth might be a ball was still very much contested by most people because everyone knew the Earth wasn't a spinning globe. It was an idea that had been pushed throughout history, sort of kicking and screaming, ultimately by the Jesuits, it would appear. If you look at the famous proponents of the globe Earth model, they're all very much connected with secret societies associated with Freemasonry, the Jesuits, etc., including Copernicus, Galileo, and even Newton himself. And of course, Cavendish, and probably Foucault, I believe. So the fact that Columbus found America where he thought he'd find the islands of Japan or the east coast of India proves that he was way off in his calculations, or the maps were way off, which could have been caused by any number of factors. The point is, Columbus would have been using maps that worked. For the known territories, of course, the maps worked, but it turned out that their world maps were missing the entire American continents. So ask yourself, is it possible that maps can work and yet not be an accurate representation of what the world actually looks like? Is it possible that to this very day, in our ignorance of the true relative sizes and distances between continents, could there still be some other continents or masses of lands which lay unknown to most of the civilizations, or even beyond the southernmost region of the plain? So we first need to understand that the latitude and longitude lines are imaginary lines based on calculations made by very patient and meticulous astronomers. When you're out at sea without GPS or Loran, which we've only had in the last, say, 100 years, give or take, if you want to find your way around, you'd better have a good compass, sextant, and a map. And you better damn know how to navigate. So as long as you know which direction to go and about how long to travel in that direction, making corrections based on observations of magnetic north or celestial bodies and using real-time calculations on a map, you can keep track of where you're going and thereby navigate an otherwise vast and unmanageable sea at the whim of the wind and the current. And this is, of course, the case whether the Earth is flat or a globe. It's truly ingenious and remarkable if you study manual navigation and the ingenuity and intelligence behind manually navigating large oceans accurately, which heavily relies on the constellations remaining constant, and of course the North Pole star Polaris remaining fixed in the north or above our north axis in the heliocentric model. Which is physically impossible, by the way, but just saying. Now, with all that being said, there's a flaw in this line of thought, or possibly we're just missing something, possibly something simple. I'm not exactly sure what that something is. It's becoming rather annoying if you want to know the truth, but unlike some of my colleagues, instead of taking my total incompetency as a cartographer and turning that into supposed proof that all flat earthers are liars, I'd prefer to look at some other ways to think about map making instead. So one very important piece of evidence that I found critical in my search for the truth was covered very nicely in zetetic astronomy, which I'll play a quick clip of. I'll mention, funnily enough, that most of my subscribers have definitely not heard this unless you've read Zetetic yourself. I'm not griping here, I just thought it was sort of interesting that I did spend a pretty good deal of time putting Zetetic into audiobook format, where about 4,000 people watched the first 15-minute section, and that number of views gradually dwindles off to the sparse couple hundred by the time we get to the section I'm about to cover. So this should be a good bit of information for anyone who hasn't read Zetetic yet, which is highly recommended. I'll try to remember to put a link to the playlist here for anyone who wants to try and listen to it in audiobook format. At any rate, I'll roll the clip for a few minutes and just let that roll. And I'll add some illustrations to get a better understanding of the data points that Robotham is trying to convey, this is a very, very important point. Another argument for the globular form of the Earth is the following. The degrees of the longitude radiating from the North Pole gradually increase in extent as they approach the equator, beyond which they again converge towards the south. To this it is then replied that no actual measurement of a degree of longitude has ever been made south of the equator. If it be said that mariners have sailed round the world in the southern region and have computed the length of the degrees, it is again replied that such evidence is unfavorable to the doctrine of rotundity. It will be seen from the following table of what degrees of longitude would be if the Earth were a globe of 25,000 miles in circumference, and comparing these with the results of practical navigation, that the diminution of degrees of longitude beyond the equator is purely imaginary, latitudes at different longitudes. According to the above table, which is copied from a large Mercator's chart in the library of the Mechanics Institute, Royal Hill, Greenwich, the distance round the Earth at the Antarctic Circle would only be about 9,000 miles. But practical navigators give the distances from the Cape of Good Hope to Port Jackson as 8,000 miles, From Port Jackson to Cape Horn as another 8,000 miles, and from Cape Horn to Cape of Good Hope, 6,000 miles, making together 22,000 miles. The average longitude of these places is 45 degrees, at which parallel the circuit of the Earth, if it be a globe, it should only be 14,282 miles. Here then is an error between the theory of rotundity and practical sailing of 7,718 miles. But there are several statements made by Sir James Clark Ross which tend to make the disparity even greater. At page 236, volume 2 of, quote, South Sea Voyages, it is said, from near Cape Horn to Port Phillip in Melbourne, Australia, the distance is 9,000 miles. These two places are 143 degrees of longitude from each other. Therefore, the whole extent of the Earth's circumference is a mere arithmetical question. If 143 degrees make 9,000 miles, what will be the distance made by the whole 360 degrees, into which the surface is divided? The answer is 22,657 miles, or 8,357 miles more than the theory of rotundity would permit. It must be borne in mind, however, that the Aboye distances are nautical measure, which is reduced to statute miles, gives the actual distance round the southern region at a given latitude as 26,433 statute miles, or nearly 1,500 miles more than the largest circumference ever assigned to the Earth at the equator. Okay, so with the known distances between the cities listed here, Robotham certainly has described a major problem with the globe model. What this also tells us is that the distance from Australia to South America is not that far to fly in 13 hours or so, which has been used by ignorant globe earthers and Tiger Dan, no less, to allegedly debunk the flat Earth. This is owing to the fact that the distances documented in Zetetic are nautical distances, and when you're navigating manually across vast oceans in either model, you're using the stars to guide your vessel, which all appear to go around the northern star in concentric circles, making east to west or west to east travel across the sea a series of arcs. This is necessarily without the luxury of GPS or geo-positioning systems, which use ground-based triangulation and possibly geostationary balloons, but not satellites. At any rate, I certainly do see a modern jetliner being able to shave off a few miles of the nautical path as described by Robotham, as the crow flies with a more accurate way to navigate instead of taking the necessarily curved arcs associated with manual navigation on the sea. I could totally see the flight from South America to Australia being completed in 13 hours by modern jetliners, even using Robotham's model that he was describing, so I'm not sure what the issue is here that everyone seems to have with that flight. If you accept the distance of 8,000 miles and say an average jetliner travels at 500 miles per hour, then it would take 16 hours traveling the route that the ship did. So, with that out of the way, there's still something missing, or we've taken too many assumptions for granted, which I believe have led to a sort of quagmire in the model, which is being piled with confusion to really add complexity to the discussion that shouldn't necessarily be there.